August 1945. The air in Japan still smelled of ash and surrender when Allied forces began rounding up prisoners across the Pacific. Convoys of trucks rolled through occupied towns, their canvas flaps snapping in the humid wind. Among the defeated were not just soldiers, but women, Japanese nurses, auxiliaries, and civilians who had been trapped in military zones. For them, captivity was not just chains or fences. It was the unknown shadow of what came next. Eyewitnesses recall how silent those first hours were. Boots scraped against gravel. Prisoners stared straight ahead, refusing to break. Some clutched small cloth bundles, the last belongings allowed to them. Others carried nothing but exhaustion. Reports indicate that by the war's end, nearly 2.7 million Japanese soldiers surrendered, and hidden within those numbers were female prisoners captured in places like Malaya, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. For them, surrender wasn't the end, it was the beginning of humiliation. From the enemy's eyes, the first shock came quickly. Rations, bread, canned milk, even soap appeared in Allied camps, things the Imperial Command had failed to provide for months. One Japanese nurse later admitted that the enemy fed them better than their own officers ever had. It created a strange dissonance, kindness wrapped in the cold steel of victory. But inside this uneasy balance, a smaller, more personal battle was about to erupt. Among these women, one symbol carried enormous weight: their long, black hair. In Japanese culture of the era, hair was dignity, womanhood, even a silent oath of loyalty. As Allied guards studied the captives, whispers spread about a ritual designed not to kill, but to strip pride. The women didn't know it yet, but their identity would soon be attacked not by bullets, but by scissors. The camps grew quiet at night, the only sound the metallic groan of gates closing. Behind those gates, fear took on a different shape. What form would humiliation take? They braced for the worst, but nobody expected it would begin with something as intimate, as visible as their hair. And it is here, where silence and dignity still hung in the balance, that the story narrows into the most shocking act of control. September 1945. The morning sun cut across the wire fences as prisoners were ordered to assemble. The guards' boots thudded in rhythm, and in their hands glinted something unexpected. Not rifles, not batons, but scissors. The women were herded into rows, their shadows long and trembling across the dirt. Confusion rippled through the line. For soldiers, punishment might mean hard labor. For these women, the order was simpler, crueler. Their hair must go. Eyewitnesses described the first cut like the crack of a whip. A nurse, barely in her 20s, froze as a guard yanked her braid tight. With a single snap, the scissors sheared through, and the long black rope fell limp onto the ground. Gasps spread, hands shot to heads, some women trying to shield themselves. But rules were rules. The guards motioned forward, one after another, scissors scraping scalp. In less than an hour, dozens of women had been shorn bare. What made it worse was the silence. No orders barked, no jeering words, just the steady crunch and blades through hair. One Allied soldier later recalled the eerie atmosphere. They didn't fight back. They just watched it fall. For the captives, each lock was not just hair, but years of identity, of culture, torn away in seconds. Statistics are hard to pin down, but reports indicate that in some occupied towns, entire groups of 30 to 40 women were lined up in a single day for this ritual. The act was not isolated. It was systematic, spreading across camps in Southeast Asia. The message was clear. Your bodies, your pride,
are no longer your own. Enemy perspective captured it best. In one diary fragment later uncovered, a prisoner wrote, "They treated us like trophies, not humans." To the women, the humiliation was sharper than hunger, sharper than captivity itself. Their braids piled up like casualties of a war that hadn't ended for them. By the time the line dissolved, the ground was scattered with thick strands, black rivers coiled in the dust. Women stumbled away, hands pressed against naked scalps, some whispering prayers, others mute with shock. The pile of hair remained behind, a grotesque monument to defeat. And as the wind began to scatter those strands across the camp, a new image seared into memory. Humiliation turned visible, impossible to hide.
The afternoon sun burned hotter as the ritual ended, but the real shock lay at their feet. The dirt parade ground was now carpeted with piles of severed hair. Long black braids, some bound with faded ribbons, others hacked unevenly and left jagged at the ends. A gust of wind lifted strands into the air, drifting like ash from an invisible fire. For the prisoners, the battlefield wasn't guns and shells anymore, it was their own scalps reflected back in the dust. Women knelt instinctively, trying to scoop back pieces, pressing them against their heads as if the hair could reattach itself. But guards barked them upright, pushing them away from the growing mound. Eyewitnesses described the metallic rasp of the scissors still echoing in their ears, like phantom blades scraping across skin. Some women complained of a stinging sensation. Though no blood had been drawn, it was humiliation that burned, not steel. Reports vary, but historians estimate that across occupied Southeast Asia, up to 300 women endured forced haircutting in the final months of 1945. For many, it felt worse than starvation. Hunger gnawed slowly, invisibly. This humiliation was immediate, public, undeniable. One fragment from a captured diary puts it starkly. It felt worse than hunger. I would rather starve than be seen this way. The smell of sweat and rusted scissors lingered in the air. Guards shoveled some of the hair into sacks, while other heaps were left where they fell, slowly scattering under boots and wind. To the women, each strand carried years of life, childhood, vows, family traditions, now ground into the dirt. Nothing about it looked accidental. The ritual was designed to brand them, to mark them visibly as defeated, powerless. From the enemy's point of view, the humiliation was effective. Bald heads were like scarlet letters, stripping away anonymity. Any attempt at escape or blending into villages was impossible. Locals could identify them instantly. Shorn heads announcing, "Prisoner, disgraced, defeated." That was the purpose. By evening, the prisoners shuffled back to their barracks, hands hovering nervously over scalps. But the hair remained, scattered across the open ground like a grotesque harvest. And as night fell, a new torment awaited. These women would soon be forced out in public, their cropped heads paraded through streets where shame became theater.
October 1945. The morning call came with no explanation. Guards ordered the women out of the camp gates and onto the road, their heads still raw from the shearing. Villagers gathered quickly. Farmers paused mid-work, children pressed forward, elders stood silent. What they saw was not enemy soldiers, not captives in chains, but women with cropped, uneven scalps, forced to walk in formation down familiar streets. The humiliation became public theater. The soundscape was jarring. Some villagers whispered, others laughed. Children pointed, imitating scissors with their fingers. A few women from the towns lowered their eyes, refusing to join the spectacle. But the weight of collective shame pressed heavier than chains. For the prisoners, each step on cobbled streets was like walking through fire. The shaved head wasn't just a mark of defeat, it was a stigma impossible to shed. Historians note that in several occupied towns across Asia, dozens of these humiliations were staged in full view of local populations. Allied troops believed it sent a message: loyalty to the Japanese Empire would be remembered, punished, and displayed. Prisoners became unwilling billboards of defeat, their bodies used as warnings. Enemy voices capture the raw pain. One testimony from a Japanese nurse recalls, "We looked like criminals, though our only crime was defeat." The cropped hair made them appear alien to their own people, stripped of feminine dignity, stripped of belonging. Unlike starvation or forced labor, this wound was visible, carried into every stare and every mocking laugh. The contrast cut deep. These women had once worn their long hair braided neatly under caps, symbols of order and pride. Now, without it, they marched as living proof of collapse. Shame clung to them more tightly than their threadbare uniforms. For those watching, the spectacle served its purpose. It dehumanized, it silenced. Few dared to look at them as fellow countrywomen anymore. By the time the procession ended, the women were returned to camp, faces burning, heads lowered. The silence afterward was thicker than any shouting had been. For them, humiliation wasn't a single act. It was a cycle, renewed every time they stepped outside. And yet, within the barbed wire of the camps, a strange paradox was waiting. The very enemy that stripped them of dignity would also feed them better than their own commanders ever had.
November 1945. Inside the wire fences, after the public humiliations, life settled into a strange contradiction. The women, their heads cropped unevenly, lined up for rations they had never seen before. White bread, canned milk, tins of Spam stacked on tables. It looked more like cargo off a supply ship than prisoner food. For those who had survived on thin rice gruel and dried roots during the war, this sudden abundance was almost unreal. Historians estimate that the U.S. military supplied 15 million rations daily across occupied zones, each averaging 3,200 calories, compared to Japan's wartime ration of barely 1,800 calories. Women who had withered into shadows now felt the shock of industrial abundance. For the first time in years, stomachs filled quickly, even uncomfortably. Some wrote later that they tasted milk for the first time in their lives. Not just a drink, but a symbol of a world powered by production, not scarcity. The contrast was brutal. Outside the camp gates, villagers still queued for scraps. Inside, prisoners ate more than their families could dream of. It created guilt, even disbelief. One Japanese auxiliary remembered, "We ate like queens of hunger." To the captives, this paradox cut deeper than the shearing of their hair. The enemy that had paraded them in shame was also keeping them alive with resources Japan itself had failed to deliver. Camps were basic: tar paper barracks, straw mats, latrines, but hygiene rules were enforced. Soap, scarce in Japan, was handed out. Showers dripped cold but steady. Women who had lived in filth during retreats now scrubbed themselves daily, forced into routines that felt alien, yet oddly comforting. The clash was psychological. Humiliation branded them in public, yet survival was maintained by those same captors. The silence at meal times told the story. Heads bent, food consumed quickly, eyes avoiding one another. They were prisoners, but healthier than before. Their own officers had demanded loyalty, but starved them. The enemy stripped dignity, but gave bread. For many, the contradiction became unbearable. Who was enemy,
and who had truly betrayed them. As weeks stretched on, the weight of shaved heads mixed with the shock of full stomachs. In that imbalance, something broke internally. Survival was secured, but identity was crumbling. And it was in that fragile mirror, seeing themselves alive, yet unrecognizable, that the deeper torment of captivity began.
December 1945. The camp barracks were cold, their thin walls rattling against winter winds. Inside, the women huddled close, not for warmth, but to avoid the mirrors. Every camp had a few. Cracked glass nailed above basins or leaning against wooden posts. For those who dared to look, the reflection hit harder than hunger. Shorn heads, hollow cheeks, eyes that no longer recognized themselves. Their long black hair had been more than vanity. It was memory, culture, dignity. Now it was gone. Testimonies reveal that the psychological impact was devastating. Some women refused to speak for days after the cutting. Others tied cloth strips around their heads, desperate to hide the exposed scalp. The cropped hair made them feel less human, less feminine. Historians note cases of depression severe enough to drive women into silence. And in rare but tragic instances, suicides followed within weeks of the humiliation. The dissonance was sharp. They were fed more than before, their bodies slowly gaining strength. But mentally, they were unraveling. A diary entry later discovered read simply, "We have no country, no face, no name." To be alive, yet stripped of identity, was a punishment beyond bars. The guards may not have seen the collapse, but the women felt it in every gesture. Some covered their heads with blankets even in daylight. Others avoided eye contact, ashamed to be seen by fellow prisoners. Where once they braided each other's hair in rituals of solidarity, now they sat apart, hands idle, silence heavier than barbed wire. Numbers tell only part of the story. Allied records logged prisoners as healthy because calories were sufficient, hygiene improved, but the documents never captured the intangible wounds. For these women's survival came at the cost of selfhood. Shorn heads became symbols of erasure, marks that branded them not just as defeated soldiers or auxiliaries, but as women stripped of their very essence. December's cold only deepened the void. Nights stretched long, and whispers often broke the silence. Questions about family, about whether they be recognized when they returned. The mirror, once a tool of routine, had become an enemy. And yet, just as despair seemed absolute, a small and unexpected act of kindness would arrive. One that hinted, however faintly, at redemption. January 1946. The new year arrived not with fireworks, but with frost on the camp fences. One morning, as the women lined up for inspection, a figure approached, an Allied nurse in a crisp uniform, carrying a bundle of cloth. At first, the prisoners tensed, expecting another order, another humiliation. But instead, the nurse reached into the bundle and handed out scarves, cotton, plain, but soft. For women whose heads were still raw with shame, it felt like a lifeline. The prisoners hesitated. Some clutched the fabric without moving. Others quickly wrapped it around their scalps, relief flooding their faces. For weeks they had avoided mirrors, but now, covered in patterned cloth, they looked at one another again. It wasn't beauty restored, but it was dignity patched together, however briefly. Records show that the Red Cross delivered more than 11,000 parcels to POW camps across Asia in 1946. Food, clothing, medical supplies.
Among these, small items like scarves, soap, and bandages carried weight far beyond their material value. For the women, the scarf was not just fabric, it was shield, symbol, salvation. Enemy testimony reflects this turning point. One prisoner later recalled, "Strange, that kindness came from the enemy." The contradiction grew sharper. The same system that stripped them bare now allowed moments of mercy. The scarf offered not just warmth in the cold January wind, but a chance to look at one another without flinching. Within days, the scarves became part of camp life. Women traded them, folded them into neat triangles, tied them with care. In the absence of hair, these cloths became new identity, quiet rebellion stitched in cotton. For the first time in months, smiles flickered, fragile but real. Small laughter returned when one scarf slipped off in the wind, prompting another to tie it tighter. Humanity, long buried under humiliation, peeked through. This act did not erase the past. The hair was still gone, the scars still present. But in a camp where despair had become routine, the gesture mattered. It suggested that cruelty was not the only language of war, and it opened a door. If the enemy could offer mercy, however small, perhaps survival could hold a different meaning. That idea would grow as release began to approach.
Spring 1946. The gates opened for repatriation. Trucks idled outside the camps, canvas covers flapping in the warm breeze. The women, heads still covered in scarves, lined up once again, but this time not for humiliation. Release had come. Their steps were cautious, heavy with months of captivity, yet different from the day they first arrived. Each carried scars, but some also carried keepsakes. The very scarves handed out in January, folded carefully, tucked against their chests as though they were treasure. Historians note that by mid-1946, over 90% of Japanese POWs across Asia had been repatriated. For the women, departure was not triumph, but a blur of conflicting emotions. They climbed onto the trucks, glancing back at the barracks where they had suffered and, oddly, survived. To leave was relief, but also dislocation. Who would they be when they returned? Would their families even recognize them, physically, emotionally, spiritually? Scenes recorded in testimonies capture the mixture of bitterness and gratitude. One former prisoner recalled that while she never forgave the haircutting, she kept the scarf her whole life. It became a paradoxical relic, born of humiliation, preserved because of mercy. These contradictions defined their memory. The trucks carried them away from barbed wire, but the scars were carried inward, stitched deep into their sense of self. The journey back to Japan revealed the stark contrast between captives and homeland. Food on Allied ships remained abundant: white bread, canned fruit, hot soup ladled into metal bowls. Meanwhile, news filtered through that Tokyo and Osaka still reeled from shortages, children scraping for sweet potatoes in fields. Survival inside enemy camps had been bitterly ironic, better fed by conquerors than by their own crumbling empire. Enemy reflections echo this transformation. A repatriated nurse later admitted, "We entered as soldiers, left as ghosts, but with strange memories of mercy." That sentence captures the essence of their ordeal. Dignity stripped, identity fractured, but humanity complicated by unexpected kindness. The scarf became a metaphor, something fragile, covering wounds without erasing them. As the coastline of Japan emerged on the horizon, the women clutched their keepsakes tighter. They were returning not as heroines, but as survivors, carrying stories too tangled to tell easily.
And once their feet touched Japanese soil, another silence began. The silence of memory buried, of voices muted in post-war reconstruction.
Japan was rebuilding, cities rising out of rubble, families piecing together lives fractured by war. For the women who returned from captivity, silence became survival. Their hair had grown back, falling again in black waves, erasing the most visible mark of their humiliation. But beneath the surface, scars lingered. Most never spoke of what had happened, neither to husbands nor to children. The shame of shaved heads, the memory of scissors, was locked away. Historians searching decades later found only fragments, diaries tucked into wooden boxes, a few testimonies whispered in interviews. Estimates suggest that less than 5% of female POW accounts survived in archives compared to the vast paper trail of male soldiers. The silence was deliberate. In a society focused on rebuilding honor, there was no place for stories of women stripped bare in camps, paraded through villages, covered later by borrowed scarves. Enemy records tell the rest. Allied reports documented food rations, medical statistics, daily counts, but they rarely noted humiliation rituals. What for the captors was a routine act of control became for the women the deepest wound of all. One survivor later admitted in private, "We never spoke again of scissors." That single line captures the generational gap between lived trauma and public memory. The legacy lives less in archives than in absence. Families puzzled over why mothers avoided mirrors, why they folded scarves so carefully, why they flinched when hearing scissors click. For children born in post-war Japan, these gestures became invisible rituals, passed down without explanation. Only much later, as historians pieced together testimonies, did the full picture emerge. Survival entangled with humiliation, mercy entwined with shame. By the late 1940s, the women blended back into society. Hair grew long, photographs showed smiles, but their silence stretched for decades. In many ways, that silence became the most enduring prison, stronger than barbed wire, heavier than iron gates. The humiliation had lasted minutes, the silence a lifetime. And that is the haunting truth of their story. Dignity can be stripped away in the time it takes for scissors to close, but silence can last for generations.